I've always believed that the smallest gestures can carry the most meaning. Little reminders that show someone they're loved, even in the chaos of everyday life. My husband, Daniel, worked long, demanding hours at a law firm, and I knew how draining it could be. Most nights, he'd come home late, rolling his shoulders, loosening his tea, and pressing a quick, tired kiss to my forehead before sinking onto the couch. It wasn't that he lacked affection. He truly was loving, but his job took so much out of him, and it hurt to see the exhaustion in his eyes. So, for Valentine's Day, I wanted to do something simple. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, just a heartfelt, handwritten letter. Something that might brighten his day, a small reminder that no matter how stressful work became, he had something wonderful waiting for him at home. I spent long with the night to omit crafting that letter, curled up on the couch with a warm blanket and a glass of wine, tapping my pen against mine as I searched for the perfect words. I wrote about the first time we met, those clumsy, uncertain early days, and late conversations that stretched until dawn. I told him how grateful I was for him, how much I cherished the life we had built together. I even slipped in a few of our inside jokes, the ridiculous that made no sense to anyone else but left us breathless with laughter. Once I was happy with it, I folded the letter carefully, tucked it inside a envelope, and sealed it with a kiss. The next morning, on my way to work, I made a quick stop at his office. His law firm was housed in one of those grand old buildings. Too much marble, not enough warmth. But the receptionist at the front desk greeted me with a friendly smile. The receptionist at the front desk warned me to a small mailbox just outside the building. I slipped the envelope inside, offered her a polite smile, and wished her a great day before heading off. That Daniel came home like he always did, exhausted but smiling. He dropped his bag by the door, loosened his tie, and kissed me hello, chatting about our day. Well, mostly his. He didn't mention the letter, and I didn't bring it up. Maybe he hadn't read it yet. Maybe he was saving it for later. Either way, figured I'd hear about it soon enough. The next morning, before I even had a chance to get out of bed, I heard the familiar sound of the mail slot creaking open. A stack of letters slid onto the floor with a soft thump, barely registering in my sleepy mind. But then, for a split second, I smiled. Dankin. That was unlike him. He was always more of a talker than a writer. But maybe Michael Valentine's gesture had inspired him. Excitement stirred in my chest as I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and shuffled over to the pile of mail. I tore the envelope open, my finger brushing over the familiar texture of the stationery. The same smooth, off-white paper I had used, its edges faintly embossed. The letter started sweetly. I got you, my love. It means more to me than you know. You always know how to make me smile, always. A warm feeling boomed in my chest until I read the next line. I need you to listen carefully. This is important. My breath caught in my throat. A strange chill crept up my spine. A nose being come home to you every night. I froze. A cold, phantom shudder rippled through me. My grip on the letter-teed pulse pounded in my ears. My hands, suddenly clammy, trembled against the paper. I haven't left the office in months. I don't know what's happened or how. But something is pretending to be me. The paper slipped from my fingers, drifting to the floor as I sat there, staring at the letter, my breath coming slow and even gusts. The words blurred before my eyes, my mind scrambling for a rational explanation. It had to be a joke, a cruel, elaborate prank. Someone at Daniel's office must have found the letter, copied his handwriting, and sent this back just to mess with me. Maybe even Danny himself. Why he'd do something so bizarre. And yet, a deep unease crept under my skin. I forced out a quiet, breathless laugh, shaking my head would clear away the absurdity of it all. It was ridiculous, completely ridiculous. Still, when I heard movement from the bafflement of sheets, the groan of the floorboards under his weight, something in me hesitated. Just for a moment. Swallowing hard, I folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and shoved it into my purse. Then, trying to shake off the lingering unease, I made my way to the kitchen to start the coffee. I reached for the matches. We had one of those old gas stoves, the kind that needed a manual spark. It had been temperamental for years, sometimes taking 2 or 3 tries before the flame would finally catch. By the time Daniel stepped into the kitchen, rolling his shoulders and running a hand through his hair, I had almost convinced myself I was overacting. "Mumming," he murmured, pressing a brief kiss to my temple. I turned the knob, and the familiar hiss of gas filled the air. The sharp, pungent scent rose, but I struck the match anyway, watching as the tiny flame flickered to life between my fingers. With a quick, practiced motion, burner, the fire flared up instantly, sudden whoosh of heat, a burst of orange and blue as the gas finally ignited. The soft crackle of the flame settled into the quiet hum of the morning. The warmth of the flame spread outward, filling the kitchen with its quiet, steady glow. And that's when, for some reason, Daniel flinched, not just a small twitch, but a sharp, full-body jolt. His shoulders tensed, his hands curled slightly at his sides, and for the briefest moment his eyes were "I'm okay?" I asked casually, glancing over my shoulder. He blinked, and just like that, the tension in his posture melted away, as if it had never been there. He said smoothly, his voice steady, just spaced out for a second. I studied his face, his movements, the little details, the way his lips felt warm when they brushed against my skin, the familiar sound of his bare feet padding against the tile, the easy way he leaned against the counter, taking his first sip of coffee. My husband, was overthinking it, letting my imagination run wild, but still, I said, forcing a light, teasing tone. "Sona love letter for me return." He raised an eyebrow mid-sip. "Love letter." I hesitated. "The one I left at your office." Fothakan, just a beat too short to be obvious. His expression didn't change. Then, almost too quickly, he smiled. "Oh, yeah. Sorry, I meant to say something. That was really sweet." I forced myself to smile back. "Did you like it?" "Of course," he said, taking another sip of coffee. "Best part of my day." I nodded, pretending his words reassured me. But I knew he was lying. If he had actually read the letter, he wouldn't have just said it was sweet. He would have mentioned the inside jokes, the memories I had written down, the personal moments that made it special. That's what he always did. Some of our jokes existed simply because he repeated them, so loved them, because he loved them. But now, he said nothing, and that silence told me everything. When I brought up the jokes himself, he laughed, but it wasn't the same. I swallowed hard and glanced down at my phone. Work. I had to focus on work. I had to push this from my mind. That evening, we sat in the couch like we always did, watching TV. His presence was familiar, his warmth pressed against me. His arm draped lazily over the back of the couch, fingers grazing my shoulder. To anyone else, it would have seemed perfectly normal, perfectly safe. With the mitter sat heady in my purse, its words repeating over and over in my mind. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake them. So after a while, I turned to him with a grin, keeping my voice net. He remember when we first met. He blinked, caught off guard. "You're testing me," he said, laughing softly. Maybe a tease nudging his arm. "Come on, you to remember." He smirked, tilting his head as if he were thinking. "It was in college, right, second year. I remember these things, you know." June, my chest tightened. Daniel was forgetful with dates. I knew that. But this date, this one had always mattered to him. It was important enough that etched it into his skin. I forced out an exaggerated gasp, smacking his arm playfully. "Of course you remember." But he didn't glance down. He didn't chuckle the way, he just smiled at me. And in that moment I knew for certain. This wasn't my husband. Tomorrow, I had to leave. The next morning, I followed my routine act before him, brewed the coffee, kissed his cheek, and told him I had a long day ahead. He smiled at me. Calm, effortless, perfect. Just like always. He ran a hand through his dark hair, took a sip of his coffee, and told me to have a good day. and I walked out the door, knowing I might never come back. As I got in repulse and stepped outside, I forced myself not to hesitate. I got in the car, started the engine, and followed my usual morning route, taking the same streets, making the familiar turns, sticking to routine, just in case. At the moment I was far enough from the house, I veered off course. Instead of heading to my office, I turned in the opposite direction and straight toward Daniel's law firm. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my fingers ached. I didn't know exactly where I was expecting. Maybe I'd walk into the building and see him at his desk, laughing with his co-workers. Maybe this was all some elaborate misunderstanding. Just a joke, a mistake. Something ridiculous and unexplainable. Maybe I just needed to see the normalcy of his workplace, to remind myself that the man who came home to me every night really was my husband. But deep down, I already knew. I stepped inside the law firm, my pulse hammering in my ears. The receptionist looked up as I approached. "Here," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm just dropping by to see my husband." Her brows knit together slightly, and for a moment, she just stared at me, like I had said something confusing, something that didn't quite make sense. Then, after a beat, her expression softened into something small and gentle. Something I immediately hated. "What's your name?" she asked, her gaze flicking toward the computer screen in front of her. "Daniel," I murmured, her lips parted slightly, almost hesitant. And then, in the softest, most careful voice, she said, "Honey, he hasn't been here in weeks." The words hit me like a slap. My breath stalled in my throat. My heart ran violently against my ribs. My fingers curled so tightly around the strap of my purse they itched. "What do you mean?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's not possible. There must be some mistake. He works here." But the look in her eyes told me that there was no mistake. "He comes in every day," I said, her voice faltering, the receptionist's expression shifty slightly, uncertainty flickering behind her eyes. She hesitated before letting out a slow, careful breath. She said, "But no one's seen in a long time. We thought maybe he took another job and just never told us. His things are still here." "Book," she shook her. "Really don't is binning." Something inside me twisted, folding in on itself. My vision narrowed, the edges of the world tilting, warping like I was struck upright in space that no longer made sense. Can I see his office?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The receptionist hesitated again, casting me another uncertain glance, but then she nodded. She led me down the hallway, past rows of desks, past open offices where people typed away at their computers, where quiet conversations hummed in the background. Everything was normal, completely detached from the factuality. My reality had cracked open into something monstrous. We stopped in front of a locked storage room. The woman placed her hand on the handle, pausing as if considering whether she should even be showing me this. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "His things are still inside. We thought he just could one day, never totally one." A hollow feeling opened in my stomach. She turned the knob, and the door creaked open. Inside, everything was untouched. His work bag rested on the chair, the strap slightly askew, left there with the unconscious expectation of being picked up again soon. His coat hung on the wall, neatly pressed, untouched by dust or time, and on his desk a pile of unopened mail sat undisturbed. I stepped forward slowly. The air in the room felt thick, pressing down on my shoulders, making it hard to breathe. I sought a single sheet of paper, placed neatly in the center of the desk. My name was written at the top. My hands trembled as I reached for the paper, and the moment my fingers brushed against it, I knew. The handwriting was his. "If you're reading this, I'm still here. Something else took my place. It everything acts like me. But it isn't me. I don't know how much time I have left. I messed with something I shouldn't have. It's afraid to fail you." My vision blurred. My breath came in shallow gasps. I wanted to collapse. I wanted to let the panic crash over me, to break down, to scream, to do reality and hold in the proof in my hands. But I didn't. Because now, it wasn't about understanding, and wasn't about figuring out what happened to Daniel or what had taken his place. It was about stopping it. I folded the note carefully, slipping it into my pocket. Then, without another word, I turned and walked to the office. I wasn't going to run. I was going to burn it alive. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. Its windows stared back at me, empty, hollow eyes. The porch light was on, casting a soft glow across the steps, and for a second, everything looked normal. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew it was waiting for me. It stood in the center of the living room, perfectly still, hands resting at its sides. Its expression was neutral, almost casual, but something about it was wrong. Something the way the corners of its mouth stretched just a little too wide. Something in the way its eyes followed me, unblinking. "Where have you been?" Daniel's voice. I forced a smile, shrugging casually as I shut the door behind me. Nowhere important. It didn't answer right away. It just watched. The air in the room felt heavy and before, thick with the weight of what I knew was coming. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I didn't. I couldn't. So, I moved past it, wolved the kitchen, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Its head tilted slightly, tracking our movements with unsettling stillness. "You're acting different tonight," it murmured. I let out a soft, easy laugh, keeping my voice light. Long day, that made it my jaw, forcing down the nausea arising in my stomach. I couldn't let it sense my fear, not yet. Step by step, I made it to the kitchen without breaking stride. The bottle of whiskey sat within reach, right where we always kept it. My fingers closed around the glass. The thing's expression didn't change. Its something shifted. Its posture tensed, its head tilting just slightly. And then, in a voice that was almost concerned, "And are you doing?" I did answer. I unscrewed the cap and turned the bottle over. Dark liquid splashed onto the floor, soaking into the old wooden panels, spreading in uneven puddles to all the living room. The sharp, acrid scent of alcohol filled the air. For the first time, the thing's smile wavered. Its voice darkened. "Stop." I didn't. Reached in my pocket, my fingers closing around cold metal. Then, with a flick of my thumb, the click of the flint wheel echoed through the silence. A single frame flickered to life, the thing's mouth twisted, stretching into something inhuman. Something unnatural. I couldn't help but flinch. "I don't do that," I said softly. But I did. With a flick of my wrist, I dropped the flame. Fire erupted. It surged across the floor in an instant, devouring everything in its path. Hungry waves of heat licked up the walls, curling around furniture, racing outward like a living, breathing thing. The heat slammed against my skin, suffocating, and in the middle of it all, the thing screamed. A sound of pure rage. Its body convulsed violently, twisting and contorting as if something was trying to break free. Its skin peeled away in strips, curling back to reveal what lay beneath. Something wrong. Something that wasn't flesh. Blackened limbs stretched and lengthening, writhing like tendrils of smoke. Its hands curled into impossible shapes, shifting, reformable but not quite. Its head cracked and buckled, folding in on itself, its features disassembling like shattered porcelain. Then it lunged. I stumbled backward, nearly dodging it and lashed out, missing me by inches. The fire spread faster, roaring up the walls, swallowing the windows, consuming the curtains. The air grew thick, choking, suffocating, the smoke coiling into my lungs. The heat was unbearable now, the house groaning under the weight of destruction. It was collapsing. I turned and ran. I didn't stop, not when the walls cracked and split, not when the ceiling above me shuddered with the strain. The front door was just ahead. I could make it. Behind me, the thing was still screaming, and I didn't look back. I threw myself through the doorway, hitting the pavement hard, rolling onto my side as I gasped for air. And behind me, the fire roared. I lifted my head just in time to see the roof cave in. Flames burst through the collapsing structure, sending embers spiraling into the night. The fire consumed everything, reducing my home than a funeral pyre for whatever had taken Daniel's place. And from within the inferno, the thing screamed, a horrible, guttural sound rage, filthy and unnatural, until finally, silence. For a long time, the only sound was the fire. The flames hissed and crackled, devouring what was left, filling the air with thick, suffocating smoke. Even from where I sat, the heat pressed against my skin, pulsing in waves. I sat there on the pavement, fingers tearing into the cold ground. My body ached from the fall. My lungs burned from the smoke. Then, movement. A faint shuffling noise. Barely audible over the roar of the fire, my stomach clenched. I whipped my head toward the house, my breath catching in my throat. A shadow moved inside the flames, staggering. I froze. I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled as I pushed myself up onto my knees, my entire body bracing for what was coming next. Then, his clothes were torch, soot smeared his face. Ash clung to his damp, sweat-matted hair. But his eyes were his. The same deep, warm brow I had memorized 1,000 times over. I knew it at a glance. He took one more unsteady step before his knees buckled, his body collapsing onto the pavement. I barely had to think, was already running. My heart pounded as I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands grabbing at his shoulders, his arms, his face. Tears blurred my vision as I cradled him, my fingers trembling against his skin. He was here. Daniel had come back. I swallowed back the sob rising in my throat, forcing my voice to stay steady. For a moment, neither of us spoke. His breathing was weak, barely there. My grip on him tightened, desperation clawing our chests. "Sarah," he rasped. "First, your orientation." Sarah introduced us. His voice was hoarse but certain. "You were wearing that be Ritter." A strangled laugh leapt from my lips. I pulled him against me, burying my face in the crook of his neck, sobbing into his skin. Clutching him as Letty meant losing him all over again. His arms were weak, but still he wrapped them around me, holding on with everything he had left. Behind us, Mutenko thousand truty ins, the doctors called it a miracle. Minor burns, smoke inhalation, nothing worse. I sat beside his hospital bed. My fingers wrapped tight was wore on. So did. Every so often, I squeezed just to make sure he was still there. And every time, he squeezed back. The first time he would his head toward me, exhaustion shone heavy in his eyes, but they were clear. He murmured, voice rough. I smiled, even as my vision blurred unsure. His lips curved into a small, tired smirk. "You look like hell." A laugh tumbled from my throat, shaky but real. "Yeah," I said, souping in eyes. "So do you."